Hello everyone, and welcome to my free material creation section of my course, Material Creation with Blender. In this free session, we're going to create a wood shader using Blender 4.3 long-term support. Now, this is part of a larger course, and I have the course on platforms like Udemy and others, but this is just a video to show how I created that process, and it's 100% free. If you like what I do and you like part of this course, I'm also going to include a link so that you can support me if you like what I do. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Hello guys, and welcome to the Blender Shader for Beginners course. In this course, we're going to first begin by learning what shaders are and how we can create shaders using the Blender interface. After that, we're quickly going to jump into creating a wood shader, some tiles, an ice shader, a brick shader, some water shaders. Then we're going to proceed by creating a moss wall and textured wall. Furthermore, I'll show you how you can create a tree trunk texture and create a fruit and orange textured background. Next, we're going to learn how to create some rocks, multi-layered rocks, and then finally, we're also going to learn how to create masks and groups. In order to actually learn more, we'll learn how to use procedural nodes to create custom art and interesting materials. All the course files are fully available in this course, and there's a full chat support. So why not join in and let's learn how to create shaders using Blender. Well, hello everyone. So over the next couple of videos, we're going to create the wood material. And before I create any material or shader, and I'll use the shader to represent the entire thing, like material shaders, the same thing literally tied together, you'd have to study and look at what you're trying to create. Now, the best materials are actually materials that have gone through a lot. So what do I mean? So let's take a look at this here. So I'm in Polyhaven, and this is the section on wood. Let me just get my mouse. It's not working. Yeah. So I'm on polyhaven.com, and I just went to the wood textures, wood category. And just looking at this is a wood floor. That's interesting. Rosewood veneer, laminate floor, and this one, if you just look at these types of wood, this one captures a lot of attention. These are worn planks, and literally every object on the planet, immediately it's been created and you leave it to the environment, the environment will start reclaiming that object. What do I mean by that? It start getting worn out, it'll start getting old, the paint is going to start getting scratched. If it's a place where people, if it's a footpath where people walk around, some of that grass is going to be affected by people stomping on it. So basically, the environment always reclaims things back. And these worn planks actually have that, characteristics. Just take a look at this. You can see it has some, dents, some scratches, a little bit of noise. That's what makes a good material, right? Because you added some realism and reality. Making shiny objects all the time, like I understand if you create a material and it's, really new, but creating shiny objects all the time, except you're doing a polished scene, you're telling a story, that's totally fine. They're very important as well. But most of the times, materials that show a little bit of wear and tear or show another material on them are the best materials. So that being said, let's go ahead and study how we can create materials. So let's look at this oak wood veneer, and I'll just, take a look at this. Let's go to Google search. And let's click on this one actually. Here, this image. Now there are some properties that you need to take note of. So if you have your notebook, I want you to write out those properties, because the way you see the material, those properties of what you observe on a material are going to be translated into the shader graph network. So let's just look at this wood and study a few things here. So I'll just right click, and let's say save image as. So we're just using this for reference, so it's not let's see if we can actually open that and take a few notes, and I'll show you how to study a material. So good. So we have this, and let's go ahead and study this. So the first thing we'll look at is the color of this material. we can actually see the color varies. So we have a variation of colors. I'm seeing some reds, yellows, and oranges. So the color varies. And that's one thing we should note about materials. It's not a single color, the color varies and it's being spread around. So color variation, right? We have some dark, we have some light, we have color variation here. And these are all the properties we're noticing on this material, right? So about 2 to 3 colors are okay. And then having dark and light spots are okay. So those are the properties we've noticed. Another thing we actually notice is wave distortion. What do I mean by distortion? So I'll go ahead and show you what I mean by that. Let's see if I can bring out my little app where I can write on the screen if it's still okay. I don't think it's here. I'll have to search for Glink and get Glink. So I'll just open it like that. And let's try this pen too, and I think I'll try, let me just erase that. Let's try something, let's try the red. And yeah, let's see if I can increase that size. Yeah, I think it's okay. So what I mean by wave, if we look at how, let's just start drawing from here, we can actually see how each of these looks somewhat like that, right? So they're not straight lines. So what we can actually call this is distortion. So we're actually seeing some distortion on each of these lines and they look like waves. So that's another property of this kind of wood. We have seen that there are specific distortions like that. Another thing we can actually notice is areas like this, we can actually see some spirals, right? So we can actually see spirals here. We can actually see some wavy lines like that. So these are all categorized under distortion as well. So you can actually see that distortion. Now, another thing I also want to point out is, so second one is distortion. We've seen some distortion. Another thing is if we zoom in, let me get rid of this and zoom in the material. Although this is a partially blurred image, there's some noise. So there's a lot of detailed particles there, or we'll just classify that as noise. So all these summed up together, we can actually see color variation. I'll just use so color variation, right? We can see distortion, we can see noise like that, and we can see spirals, distorted spirals. So this is still under distortion. So we can actually just notice these properties. Now within our program, within Blender, we have nodes that can do this, right? We've seen that example. We have nodes that can actually do this. For example, with the wave texture. We also have properties we can use to create distortion in a noise texture, and we can also create fine particles using a noise texture, and we can also use the wave texture to create spirals. So by studying a material, by looking at a material, it'll give you an idea of what kind of nodes you can actually use to create that. So for instance, for the color variation, we can use a color ramp. Right, color ramp. For distortion, we can use a wave or lacunarity in the noise texture. For creating fine micro details, we can use noise, right? So exactly, that's the name. That's actually a noise. And for spirals, we can actually use the wave or lacunarity as well, or we can have circular materials and distort them so that they look like that. So look at a material, study the material, and break the material down into several components or sections so that we can be able to create the material. So in our next lesson, we'll pick up these ideas based on this material study and see how we can map these concepts to create a wood texture. See you guys in the next lesson. All right, so let's begin creating our wood material. We'll go to File, and first save our project, and let's call this our wood 100, and let's click save. So we'll be saving multiple variations for this. So first we need an object where we can use that object to see our cube. So I'll do Shift A, and let's add a mesh. So I'll add a cube, and what I'll do is just scale this. So I'll go over here, scale on the x-axis, make it slightly taller, and scale on the y. I think that's not bad material to preview wood. So now we actually need to work on this material, this object. So I'll go to edit mode and click on the edge, select this edge, and we could do a Control B just to bevel that edge like that. Now we could do the same thing here, Control B. And I know there are easier methods here, but we just want to do this. Control B and Control B just to bevel that edge. The bevel option might have been the best thing to do. So I hit A to control all, I'll right click, and I'll subdivide, right click, subdivide again. All right, and what we'll do is to go to our object, like that, and we could add a modifier. Let's search for the bevel. So we add a bevel modifier to the object, and for the amount, let's just raise this up a bit, and we'll increase the number of segments like that. And what we can also do is to, I think we can leave it like that. We don't want it to be very highly detailed, but if you want, we can add a subdivision surface to this object, and we'll increase the levels in the viewport just to make it a dense model we can use to preview our wood. So with that done, what we can quickly do is to set up our render engine. So I'll go over here, I'll set it to cycles. Now I'm going to set the device to the GPU, and here for max samples, I'll set that to 200. And we'll need a couple of lights, but I'll use a HDR for the environment. So I'll click on the world properties, click on color, and click on environment texture. And let's click the open file. So you can browse to the folder where you have your HDRI materials and select any material you want. Remember, you can always change your materials. I'll use the Little Paris. So I'll use the Little Paris Eiffel Tower and click on open image. We can't see that effect yet, so I'll click on the viewport shading, and we can actually see that. So we can use that lighting on this object. So if this is distracting, the background is distracting, all we need to do is to go back to the render settings here, our render properties, and let's go down to film and turn on transparent. So with the option set to transparent, we actually know that we have an HDRI material acting on our object. You can add a sphere to this, but I think that will be a good primer for this. We'll make any other changes we want to make as we progress along. So one of the first things to do is to create a material. So I'll tear out a screen like that, and here we'll set it to our shader editor. I'll just close this section. So we have a blank spot here, and I'll make sure I'm on the cube, right? So I'll just call that our wood. So make sure we are on this wood, and we'll click on new to assign a new material. If we go over to the material properties and scroll up, we'll actually see that this is the material on it. Let's call this material wood. And that's it. So we have a wood material, and we have the shader where we'll be creating this wood material. So the first, based on what we've actually learned in our other class where we looked at the material and studied it, what we want to do is to start with some noise. So here I'll go to add texture and go to noise texture and just drop that. If you have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can Control Shift click and you can see a direct response on how that object actually looks like. So here we're just seeing that over here. I'll press T and N to get rid of those overlays, and if we want, we can even get rid of the floor like that, so we can have just a nice clutter-free section. So we can Control Shift click. If for some reason your Node Wrangler isn't enabled, we can go to File. Let's go to Edit, Preferences, Extensions, add-ons, and we can search for Node Wrangler and make sure this is enabled so that you can Control Shift click on any object to make that. So what we want to do is to make the scale slightly smaller because it's kind of blurry. So let's set our scale to, I'll just zoom in on this object like that. I'll set the scale to say 8 just to make it smaller. So you see the larger we go, the smaller it is. I'll set it to 8 or 9, it doesn't really matter. For the detail, I'll set it up to 15 like that. For the roughness, I'm going to leave it at default. Linearity is also going to be at default. For my distortion, I'll set it to, let's say 1, just to have that wavy feel. So we noticed our texture had some wavy feel to it. So I'll set this to 1. Let's try 1.2. Just to make it, just like that. I like how that is. And we'll leave the normalize option turned on. If we turn it off, you can see we get a very rough black and white detail. There's some stretching here, but we're not worried about that right now. To get rid of that, we might use the object space, but we can actually see that. So I'll leave normalize on. And I kind of like what that thing did. So what we'll do is to create another texture, we're going to mix with this. So let's add another noise texture that will mix with this texture. So let's go to add, let's go to texture, and let's go to noise texture and just drop this. So let's Control Shift click so that we're on this texture right now. You can see it's just getting to our material output and connecting to our material output. So now that we have this, we wanted to have some of that, so we'll turn off the normalize so we can have this. Let's set the scale to say 8. Let's set our detail all the way up so you can see with more details, you can see how we're seeing that scratchy edges going through, and it's adding that noise. So, and it's like making it quite sharp. So we'll set the detail to say 12. I think 12 is fine. For the roughness, let's push that up to say about 1. So we have very grainy and scratchy noise details like that. For linearity, I'll leave that at 2. And our distortion, we can slightly distort, but no problem. Let's just set that to 0.1. So you can actually see that like this. Nice. So what we're going to do now is to mix these two noise textures together, and we'll use the mix shader. So another way to quickly have access to the options, to the shader options, is to use Shift A, and then you can quickly search for a mix. So you can see a mix shader and mix color came out. So I'll just use mix color, but I like using this menu here because you can easily see which category these objects are grouped. So here our mix color is grouped under the color category, and you can see we have these two options. So first thing I'm going to do is to take the output of our noise texture here, and I'll take the factor output and put that on B, and let's Control Shift click on our mix shader. So this is what we're seeing, and let's take our noise texture, the initial one, factor, and let's set that at A. Right, and let's set our factor to like point. So if we drag it to the left, we're taking one material and it's favoring another material. So I'll leave it at say 0.6. And let's say 6. Like that seems to be a good value. So already we have two shaders, we're mixing them, but this is not really looking like, let's go ahead and connect our output, which we've done already. So this is not really looking like the wood material we wanted to work on. We can try swapping these positions if we want, but it's okay. So factor data. So this is not really looking like, and we'll pass that to our principled. So let's Control Shift click our principled and drag our mix and place that in the base color. So now you can see we have this material and it's not really looking like wood. So what's happening and why is it like that? Well, there's an option, an input node called the texture coordinate, and basically it supplies, different coordinate types for your UV mapping. Our UVs are how our textures are being aligned on a 3D object. So we can use the texture coordinate to ensure that we have a smooth pattern, and we'll change the scaling with a mapping node. All that sounds like, let's just put this into practice and see what we're doing right now. So the first thing we're going to do is to bring in a texture coordinate. So we can go to add input and we can see a texture coordinate, and we'll just place that. And what we want to do is to pass the object into our noise. So let's go ahead and also add a mapping node. So I'll just do a Shift A and type mapping, and that's a vector category, and I'll just place the mapping node here. So we'll take our object and pass that into the scale, and then we'll now take our scale and pass that into the vector input like that. And then we can set values for our scale. So let's just go ahead and do that. So I'll set the X value to 1, the Y value to, sorry, I'm actually on this. So we should set the input for the object into the vector type to control that. And then we can manually change our scale objects. So I'll set the Y to say 0.12. And I'll set the Z to the same value, 0.12. Now let's just try this. And now you can see we have some of those vertical lines we wanted. We can actually make this thinner. So this is looking more like the direction we actually have for our wood material, right? So that's what the texture coordinate is going to do. And what we can do is to play around with our distortion. So let's try distorting this and try the lacunarity. And let's try it here as well. And basically we're generating a lot of that, pattern for the noise. We can select each one separately and see how that looks like. And let's try this as well. So you can see that. And on our mix shader, we can play around with the factor to see more of one material or less of another material. All right, so we're going to stop the video here and continue in our next lesson where we keep adding more details to this material. Also, what I wanted to point out is that we can change the intensity of our environment texture. If I go to world, here where we have strength, we can set this to a value of say 0.5. So we have half of that strength affecting our material. And we can always change this into any material we want. For example, I could change this to the dam wall, or we can use spruce sunrise. Basically, you can change your view, and you can actually have variations of that view. So thank you very much for watching. In our next lesson, we'll continue working on our wood material. Hello guys, and you're welcome back. So in this lesson, what we're going to do is to add our additional details and then mix those details together. And we want to create that wavy detail we noticed that exists on some wood textures. So let's go ahead and do that. So first I'll add in a noise, and I'll use the shorthand method. I'll say Shift A, and I'll add in a wave like that. So let's drop in a wave texture, and I'll just zoom in on that wave texture. So let's go ahead and make some changes to the wave texture. So I'll Control Shift click on that, so I can just be viewing that wave texture like that. So we're just looking at that directly on our material output. So what we're going to do is make a few changes. So first I'll set the scale to, I'll make it smaller. I'll set this to 0.5 like that. And I'll also add a texture coordinate to this wave texture. So let's just do that. So let's say Shift A, and let's just start typing texture coordinate. There we go. We hit the return key. And what we want to do is to take the object and pass that into the vector slot. And next, let's look at our distortion. Let's set this to a value of, say, 5. And we're starting to get some output. Let's set our detail to 0.1, like that. And let's set our roughness to 0.8. And let's go ahead and view that. So let me add a wave texture. So I'll do Shift A, and I'll search for wave texture and just place that wave texture, and I'll Control Shift click on the wave texture. Now the problem is the wave texture is mapped to the edges here. So any changes I make, I'm only going to see in the edges, and I want this to be mapped to the object as well. So to do that, we'll need to use a proper mapping and texture coordinate node. So let's go ahead and add those. So I'll do Shift A and search for a texture coordinate like so. And I'll do Shift A and add a mapping. So I'll just type mapping. And what I'll do is to first take the object to the vector, and I'll pass that vector to our objects vector. And it's still mapped to the sides. So let's change some of these options. Let's try generated. And it's mapping to that edge's UVs. Let's try using the UVs themselves. And I think UV isn't a bad option, so we'll use UVs since it's giving us these details here at the edge. So let's mess around with our scale. So for the scale, we'll set it to a value of about, say, 5, or we'll make this smaller. Let's say 0.5 actually. So that's so small, it's actually just mapping that there. So we'll just drag this till we have some of those scales like that. For the distortion, let's try a value of 5. So 5 seems to be okay for the distortion. And for the detail, let's just bump this up to about 15. For the detail scale, let's try any random value. So I'm just guessing these values. I think 4 is okay. All right, and then for our phase offset, we'll just leave that, but we can add some variations to the phase offset just to have some of that texture, so we can actually see how that's mapped to this object. So what we want to do now is to combine this with another noise. So we can combine these two together by adding another mix shader node. So let's go ahead and see what happens when we combine this detail. So I'll Control Shift click, and I want to combine that with this wave texture we just created right now. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll add a mix node. Now, if you already have a node, we could just Shift D to duplicate it and place it here. So what we want to do is to take the output of this node and pass that into A. Basically, I'm saying this, pass that into A. I will take the factor and pass that into B like that. And let's Control Shift click and see what we have right now. Now, mixing our two textures using the mix node. So I've taken all this output from here and duplicated and created a new mix node, and now we have this, and we will notice that we're actually getting distortion, but we want a horizontal distortion, not a vertical distortion. And here's one thing: this looks like moss growing on a wall and it's like vertical. So to change it to a horizontal direction, we can actually click on this and click on Y. Now we actually have that distortion in a vertical manner, right? So, and to see that, if we drag the factor to 0.1, it means it's favoring our node here, our node setup here from the mix shader. If we drag this fully towards the right, towards 1, we can see our full distortion effect. And then if we drag this towards the center, we're getting a mixture of both effects, and that's going to be represent our distortion on that wood. We can do things here and increase some of this to make it, more distorted, and we can actually begin to see those rings starting to form around, like we've seen rings in the wood. So it depends on how you want to set this. So now that we have that mix, what we want to do is to take this new output as the input into our base color. So I'll just take this and drag this as the new input to our base color, and then I'll Control Shift click to set this as our output. In our next lesson, we'll learn how to add additional details. Now you can add as much details as you want or as few details as you want. The more details you add, the more realistic the wood is going to be, and you can describe the surface quality or attributes of that texture. So in our next lesson, we're going to add an additional level of detail on our wood material. Hello guys, and welcome back. So in this lesson, I'll show you how you can add annotations or notes, and also how you can group your nodes for organization. So the first thing we want to do is let's maximize this. I hit Control Spacebar to maximize our shader view like that. And it's cool actually having a second monitor, because you could just put your shader on one monitor and then you have your shader view, so you have all the space to work. But for me, I have one monitor, that's why I'm actually sharing this space. So yeah, Control Spacebar like that. I'll be in this window, Control Spacebar. So the first material we created was our texture. Now, apart from the mapping nodes, so I'll leave the mapping nodes separately. What we can do is to add a frame. So go to Add, go to Layout, and you have a frame right here. So we'll place the frame here and select all these three objects and drag them into the frame. I'll just select the frame, just move the frame around like that, and select these three and place them inside the frame. So now they are all in this frame. So what we can do is to name this frame. To name the frame, let's open up the properties. Here where it says label, I'll just call this wood base. So that has a title now, it's called the wood base. What we can do is add a color. So you can just go over here and select any nice little color you want. And let's just darken that a bit. So that's our wood base, and this is where we create our wood. So let's do the same thing for the other ones. So here, this is our detail 1. So I'll go over here and select these and call them our detail 1, and we have detail 2, right? So we have these two details. I'll leave the color out of it, and if you want, you can leave the mapping, but I just like having the texture alone. Now this is alone, but I can still add a frame if I want to. So I can go to Add, Layout, Frame. I'll just place that here. So I'll go to Add, or since we have this already, let's just use Shift D to duplicate that, and I'll just place this here. So I'll copy these two, drag them into this frame and release. So that's one frame, and I'll just take this guy and drag it into this frame. So that's another frame. So I'll call this detail. I'll call this detail A. So that's detail A. We can actually see showing detail A right here. And for this one, I'll call this detail B. Detail B. So we have detail A and detail B. Totally awesome. So we have these details, but how do we add notes, right, to these guys? Apart from just adding color, how do we add notes? Well, you can see over here, it says text. If I click on this, it's looking for a text for me to add information here. So how do we create that text? I'll show you. So to do that, we can tear out a new menu, right? But we have to exit this scene. So hit Control Spacebar. And I'll just drag this to the left because we're not using that window now. So I'll just drag this to the left. At the bottom here, let's just pull out a new window at the bottom. And over here on the editor type, let's set that to the text editor. So I'll just go over here, patient, text editor. That's it. So let's create a new text. I'll call that wood_B, hit enter, and I'll call that wood base here. So we have a text called wood base here. I'll just drag that down. So over text here, we can see wood base B, and we can actually see it here. So it says wood base here. So we can set the label size to a small size or a larger size, depends on what you want to do. And you can use that to, explain or add little notes around. You don't need to necessarily put it in there. For instance, you could just create a layout, an empty frame. So this is just going to be a frame describing what you did here. So let's create a frame and write a description of what we actually did here, because we mixed our wood and detail A using a mix color node. So let's go back to our text. Let's click on this to create a new text. Let's just call that wood plus detail A. So that's the name. So here we're going to say adding wood and details. It's details. I forgot how to spell details. So yeah. So what we can now do is to select this, and we can add the text. It says wood and details. It says we're adding wood and details here. We can make this big or small, and we can add a text here, or we can leave it if we want to reserve that space. So that's how you can add, notes. If there are any settings you really like, you can quickly create a frame and type in those settings. If you made a change, for example, here on the wave texture, I really remember when we were creating this wave texture. Where are you, Mr. Wave? There you are. There you are. We played around with this. Let's try making this horizontal. So I'll just go here to the bands and I'll set it to X. And what it actually did was to set our bands horizontally. So that's our output. When we change this, we can try changing it back to Y or to X or to any direction we want. And we can play around with our scales and just have fun, distorting and making changes to our already existing objects like that. All right, so that's going to be it for our wood material. And we could easily do this in 20 minutes, but I wanted to spend time to explain what each node actually does. Thank you very much for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next tutorial. Hello guys, and welcome back. In our last lesson, we saw how we could add color, and we also added some roughness details from a black and white data, which we passed into our texture. This time around, let's go ahead and see how we can work with the normal map. So the normal is it creates the illusion of depth, and you actually use the normal on each vertex to describe how pushed or bumped a surface is. And to use that node, we need to add a bump node. So we'll go over to vector and click on bump and just drop bump right here. We want the height data. Basically, we want a black and white image with black spots representing dents like going in, and white spots representing a pushed area. And we actually saw that this here, our color ramp from our node, which is this node over here. This combination of nodes was a good node to use because of its black and white properties. So we'll borrow from that node. So that's one cool thing about PBR materials. You can always borrow existing data and convert that data and use that data. So here we're going to take the color out and pass that into the height section. So let's do that and pass that into the height. We won't really get any info, but let's drag that and push that into our normal. And what happens is the strength is very strong. We are actually experiencing something super weird going on right here. So the bump is just too high, and all we need to do is to just dial it down a little bit. So we'll go over here. We have values for the strength. We'll just set this to 0.1 like so. And just by setting this to 0.1, you can actually see we've added an additional level of detail. If I could just zoom in, you can actually see how that light is reacting to this object now, because we have an additional bump on that surface. And this actually shows us how, you know, rough that surface is with its imperfections, like that. So what we can do is still dial down the strength. I'll try 0.025, just so we have, you know, we don't have that bump really strong like that. So this is a good value for me. I really like that bump value. And also, if for some reason that, you know, the roughness is too high, remember we actually have sections here where we could just change that value, right? We can make it very high or very, very low like that. Again, we can make it high or very low. All right. So we can always go back here and still add, let's try 0.0, let's say 0.05. So I'll say 0.05, just to use that. So I like how that looks. So that's how we can, you know, create a wood material procedurally. And that means we can always change things. If this was an image, it's just one image. But with a PBR texture like this, we could have the same texture, you know, react to different lighting conditions. We don't need to create another texture for the night or day because we're taking advantage of the shader. That's why it's important. For example, I can go over here and change the light source to a skylit garage. Now we're going to see how this material looks like in a skylit garage. And we can always change the strength of our light source. I'll just set that to 1. And also what we can do is to change our color. So say for example, we want to change this color just to, you know, have a variation. We can add a hue saturation node. So I'll go to color and I'll go to a hue saturation value node and place that in between. And now what we can do is begin to play with the hue. I'll try 0.48. So you can see it makes it more red, which I actually prefer this reddish color for the wood. You'll see how that looks. Looks really nice. And yeah, that's how we can play around and make some changes on the object. Lots of options, but this is our first material. And one piece of advice I'd like to give you is that it might look very hectic with a lot of parameters, but remember how we broke this down. So in the next lesson, I'll show you how you can organize your nodes, add notes to yourself in your nodes, such that when you come back months after, you remember what your nodes are and what they were doing and why you made some choices. And also I'll show you how you can organize your nodes into groups just to make it much more readable and enjoyable. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson. All right, and welcome back everyone. So as much as I like how this texture is, I still feel we're losing some of that wavy quality. So let's go back and see what we've done here. So here on this noise texture, I'll just Control-Shift-Click on this texture, and you can see I really like this, you know, feature quality because it those properties we described about the wood, about how it's curvy, you know, wavy. I'm getting all that detail here. So I'll take advantage of that. So I'll quickly undo this to get back to our default connection. And what I'll do is to take the factor of our noise and then plug that into the factor of the vector slot of our detail, like that. So that should bring in some of that quality we can see here. So where we're mixing, we can now begin to reduce some of that, you know, to take advantage of this. So if this 1, that's that, but we can drag this over to this value to take advantage of that. So we're just mixing these two together like that, and you can see we have that, you know, nice wavy quality there. So we can do it over here as well. We can dial that down to have some of that, you know, detail show through. And this actually looks like some tree bark material, but I'll just drag this down to say I think 0.1 is fine. So we can actually see that. I think I'll even take this to 0.5, or let's set it to 0.1 for that mix. And I really like how this, you know, is actually coming out. You can see that wood texture is showing finely. So what we're going to do next is to begin to change our contrast and also add some color. All right, so studying our material between our wood, which is this section, our detail A and our detail B, I'm going to call that detail B. We actually see here where we're adding the wood and detail A, we're passing the results to our principled shader right here. So I think this is a good place to add a color ramp and add the color, so you can pick that color and pass it to our material so we can see this. So to do that, let's go to add and go to converter and go to color ramp, and let's just place that color ramp over here in between our mix, our final mix, and the base color, because this is where we want to make some nice contrast, and after we've done that contrast we can add that color. So here I'm just going to zoom in and drag some of this, and you can see we're having some of that dark, you know, values from the wood coming through. And we can always change this since it's a PBR material. We could just look at that from different angles, and I'll bump up the lights as well. All right, so we're making this light and making this dark like that. I'll just bump this, and I think that's a good value to add contrast. So next, on this black spot, I'll just click on this and push this slightly up a bit. And what I'm basically doing is playing around with the value. I'm just raising the value, and I can pick any color like that, some dark wood texture like that. So I think that's totally fine. You know, it's actually red. I don't want it to be fully red, so I'll just try and go for like a brownish kind of color. So I'll move this and darken this a bit. Oh yeah, I'll just lift that up. So I just used a value of 0.09. We can try just 0.1 for the value, and for the color we can use a hex value, and this is the hex value I'm using for the color, 593 ATF. So that's the value I'm using for the hex color. Now for the light part of the wood, we can use a lighter value. So I'll just drag this down a bit. Right, so we'll just change the value. So I'll go back to HSV. So I put the value around 0.5. If you drag up, you can actually see it's around 0.5, and you can use a lighter color like that. Or we can even make the wood any material color we have for wood. We can make that orange. Yeah, I think that's not bad color for wood. So we don't have any roughness data, so I'll just go over here and maybe make this slightly bright like that. Yeah, I think this is a good value. I like this. So let me click on this so we can get the hex value. It's D6A160 in case you want to use the same values I'm using. So what we can also do is to add another additional color in between these two colors, right? So to do that, we'll just go over here on the color ramp and click this plus button. So now we have an in-between color, and what I'll do is just go over here and tilt that towards orange and just darken that a bit, just to add a little bit of contrast. So you can see we have these three values and they're all being affected on this object, which is super great. Now our roughness data is going to determine how polished or how dull our surface is. So what I mean is, if I take this to 0, it means this object is so polished, it looks so, it looks like extremely polished wood that you can actually see the environment through that. So that means it's 0 rough. Any incident light that falls on this wood material just bounces out, without any refraction. So that's some physics terms, but it just means the more I add to this, it's going to be dull. So here, this is very unpolished wood. It's not reflecting any information. So what I can do is just drag the roughness down to see about 0.4, and we can see we're getting that slight reflection back. Another cool way to work with reflections or roughness is to use grayscale data from your existing map just to improve that. Basically, if 0 is very rough and 1 means extremely rough, having range of values will actually simulate that surface imperfection. Let's just quickly learn how to do that. So we can pick the same information here, but this is color information now, and we want the roughness to be a grayscale value. So what we'll do is to go and look at some of our textures. Let's say sorry, what did I do? I think I must have accidentally clicked on something. Oops. All right, so we're back. I think I accidentally clicked something. So I want to pick the roughness data from one of these. So I can add I'll just drag this. Let's click on this and see how it looks like. So this is where we have our, our small detail particles exactly. So we'll use this for our roughness. So I'll just undo that and drag out a node. So I'll just pull this out, and here I'll just look for the color ramp. And now what we're getting is the black and white data, the factor. And with that factor, I'll just dial this down a bit, like that, bump this up. And what I'll do is to connect that to our roughness. So I'll just go, I can even pull this really close like that, and then take this data and put that in our roughness slot. And now what we can do is begin to adjust the roughness so that we can match the roughness we want, and it's getting that information from the surface. So now you can see that it's looking like wood that it seems to be polished, but there's a lot of dirt and dust on the surface. So you can actually see that it's simulating that kind of look on the material. So you can see that from the back. So it's actually breaking that surface form like there. And we can control how that roughness looks like by, dragging these sliders. So if we drag this towards the right, it means it's very rough. If we drag that towards the left, where it's toward white, it's not that rough. So we can just drag and set that value like that. And I'll just drag this a bit. Yeah, so we can see how we can use roughness to break the surface details. And it all depends on how you want to set that. So I'll just drag that back, because I don't want it to have, all that information. So that's how we can create our procedural wood material. we can do things like, increase the HSV value. And again, this doesn't really look 3D. We can take advantage of an additional node, which is the bump node. So in our next lesson, we're going to add surface deformation and simulate a bump on the surface, and also learn how to add other ways to improve the color. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next lesson. Hello guys, glad to have you back. So what we're going to do now is to add additional grainy noise details. We'll mix at least 2 grainy noise details to our new texture setup. So here, let's create a new additional setup. So I'll create a noise. I'll do Shift A and I'll say noise, and I'll add a noise texture. Now let's just Control Shift and click on that noise texture, and this is what we get. We get this noise that's just just wrapped around. So let's go ahead and make this quite smaller. So I'll turn off the scale for about 18, and I'll bump up the detail to 15. I'll dial up the roughness a bit so it's a bit noisy. So let's duplicate this. I'll do a Shift D to duplicate this noise, and I'll Control Shift click on this new duplicate, and I'll just invert that. So I'll turn off the normalize, and we can actually see we have very rough scales like that. So I'll dial down the scale like so, dial down the detail to like 9, dial down the roughness, turn it up so we have very noisy roughness like that. So what I'll do now is to mix these 2 noises together. So we're mixing this noise, Control Shift click, and this noise like that. We're going to join them together using a mix node. So I'll do Shift A, and on the color I'm going to click on mix color, and I'll mix both factors together. So I'll take out the factor for A, place that in B, take the factor of B, place that in A, and I'll Control Shift click on this. So we're getting both of these mixed together. Now all I'm going to do is to change, I can change this to say multiply, just to change the blend mode, and I'll drag the factor to favor one of the materials. So I'll just drag this over here so we can see more of A. So now that I have this mix, what I want to do is to create a new mix node to mix our middle detail with our third detail. So the first one is our wood. Then we have detail A and detail B. So here we're going to create a new mix and mix detail A, detail B, and detail C. I'll call this my detail C. So to do that, let's go ahead and add our mix color, and I'll just place the mix color around here and just zoom in. And like I said, I want to mix this and this. So here I'll take the output and place that into A, and I'll take the output and place that into B, and I'll Control Shift click just to see the results of that mixture. So we're just adding additional details on details we already have that exists already. So let's just see this, and now we can actually see it's actually a fairly good mix like that. So let's go ahead and play around with the factor if you want to see more of the A or more of that B mix. So I'll just drag it over here so I can favor more of A. So I'll set the factor to about 0.4 so we can actually get that mix. So what we're going to do now is to take the output of that mix and place that in the input like so. I will take this and just Control Shift click on our shader so we can see the result. I'll just drag this down a bit just to have a little coordination like that. So I'll just drag this and place this over here. So that's what we're getting as our result like that, which is quite nice and fair. So what I want to do now is to ensure that these coordinates are actually being represented by adding a mapping and texture node. So I'll just select these two. I'll do a Control C and Control V, paste that, or I'll select these two and Shift D, and I'll just drag that and place that down here. And what I'll do is to pass the vector data into these two objects, just to improve the mapping or how they are being mapped on the surface. Sometimes it turns out great, sometimes it doesn't turn out great. So it depends on your preference. If you like it, you leave it, and if you don't like it, you can just always get rid of it. Alright, so we've seen how we can create different materials, and we haven't even added information to our roughness, right? Because our roughness is going to give the indication whether our wood is polished or not. And in our next lesson, we'll begin to change the contrast and add some color just to bring our wood material to life. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next lesson.